Hello and welcome to the next lecture for our class. Today's topic will be World War II, the home front. There are a couple of themes I'd like to address in this presentation. First of all, I'd like to show how the size and the power of the national government grew tremendously during the war in order to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Next, we'll explore the impact of the war on American society, the economy, and race relations. What you want to do is to keep this question in the back of your mind. Do you think those changes that took place during the war were positive or negative for the nation? The first topic will be the growth of government agencies, particularly dealing with finances. We now know exactly how much the war cost. About $250 million a day, which is a tremendous sum of money. There were two primary solutions the government had in order to come up with the money. First of all, a lot of the money was borrowed. You can see some statistics on the left here about what the US debt was in 1941 versus 1945 at the end of the war. On the right, we see a poster where everyone could contribute to the war effort by purchasing war bonds. This is how the government borrowed the money, primarily from the American people. The image here helps to show the growth in the US debt through the war itself. The second solution was seen in an act passed by Congress in 1942. This was the Revenue Act. The Revenue Act did two things. First of all, for the first time in the country's history, the government implemented withholding taxes. Rather than waiting until the end of the year to collect people's taxes, every 2 weeks when people were paid, or every week, whatever it was, a little bit of money was taken out of everyone's paychecks in order to allow the government to have access to the cash throughout the year as opposed to at the end of the year. Secondly, the tax rates for all Americans were increased. Here you see the top federal tax rates for Americans throughout much of the 20th century. By the end of the war, the highest tax rate was 94%. So if a person had an income of above $200,000, anything above $200,000 was taxed at 94%. That's a really high rate. And $200,000 in 1944 would be about $2.5 million today. The Revenue Act was very successful as it allowed the national government to generate 20 times as much tax revenue by the end of the war than it had prior to the beginning of the war. We also see that theme of the growth in the government's power. The government could gain access to the tax dollars throughout the year and take a little bit out of everyone's paycheck. Now, I just thought that I would also talk about something else. While those tax rates were incredibly high during World War II, they were lowered over the years. And yes, the United States did have a high federal debt at the end of the war. If you see the arrow on the bottom chart here, notice how high the debt is there. That the debt from World War II was paid off by the 1960s. The debt that we have today is actually from other programs. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester. We'll continue by exploring the idea of government control over the economy and people's lives. We'll see that the government's power grows in size as well as power through the creation of three government agencies: the War Productions Board, Office of Price Administration, and the Office of Censorship. The War Productions Board was in charge of converting the U.S. economy away from producing things like radios and refrigerators and stoves and ovens, and instead to military supplies. The best example of this was seen in the auto industry. On the left, we see an image of Don Nelson. Prior to the war, he was the head of Sears and Roebuck, but eventually he became the chair of the War Productions Board. He was one of many dollar-a-year men who worked for the government at a salary of $1 a year. The WPB was so effective that by late 1945, the United States was outproducing the Axis powers combined.
Some examples of Michigan's involvement in the auto industry and in the production of war supplies are shown here. Chrysler focused on tanks, and on the right we see an advertisement for Tanktown, USA. Ford produced many Jeeps and airplanes. The planes were produced at a brand new facility called Willow Run. A huge assembly line, largest in the world, was used in order to piece together different planes. The length of this was over 1 mile, and it was a quarter-mile wide. Critics charged that you couldn't assemble planes because they were just too big. Well, it took a while to establish the Willow Run facility outside of Detroit, but by the end of the war, one completed plane was coming off that assembly line every 63 minutes. Here you see the assembly line for the B-24 Liberator bomber.
Some additional examples are shown here. On the West Coast, we see Kaiser shipyards producing many vessels for the war effort. And on the right, we see an image from Boeing. This was a small aircraft company prior to the war, but it expanded operations for the war effort and was very successful during the war.
Products produced in the United States, and particularly in Michigan, were shipped all over the world, and they were used by the Allies to defeat the Axis powers.
Another government agency was called the Office of Price Administration. There were huge problems with getting access to goods during the war, and so the OPA was in charge of rationing, and they also established price controls. Families were issued ration books like these. If you wanted to buy butter or sugar or coffee or some other items, you had to have the money for those things, but you also had to have a coupon for the butter, the sugar, or whatever the product may be. The ration books were issued to families based upon the number of people within the family, the number of children, number of adults living within a household. A range of different products were rationed, like steel, sugar, coffee, butter, as I mentioned before, rubber, gasoline, and many others. There was a popular slogan at the time: use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. In order to encourage people to cut down on their use of gasoline, a national speed limit was also implemented. It was 35 miles an hour. Posters such as these encouraged people to gather up any scrap rubber that they may have in order to contribute to the war effort. And then on the right, we see another poster encouraging people to become involved in a carpool. At the time, they called them car clubs. Everyone could contribute to the war effort by sacrificing in a variety of ways. Another government agency was the Office of Censorship. The goal of this organization was to promote patriotism and control or influence public opinion. For example, if servicemen were writing back to their families at home, those letters were all reviewed in order to make sure that they didn't have important details to them. In the months after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the casualty figures were not released to the public for quite some time because they were worried that this would lead to depression among the American people. Also, photos of American war dead were not seen by the American people for quite some time, again, in order to try to maintain a positive atmosphere among the American people. And then later, the members of the media, whether it was newspapers, newsreels, whatever, they were encouraged to publicize Japanese atrocities against American soldiers. So the bottom line here is that with the creation of these government agencies, we see a growth in the size of the national government, the number of employees increasing, as well as the power of the national government. Next, we'll explore American society in the economy, initially with a focus on patriotism. I want to show this image once again because I just want to emphasize the patriotic behavior of people like Don Nelson, one of these dollar-a-year men who gave up their lucrative positions in business and joined the government in order to help with the war effort against the Japanese and Germans. So do we have any baseball fans out there? On the right, we see the highest paid baseball player in 1941. His salary was $55,000 a year. He played for the Tigers. He went from the $55,000 a year to $21 a month, demonstrating his patriotism. Do you know his name? Well, it was Hank Greenberg, who switched uniforms and got a lower salary, demonstrating his patriotism. And by the way, it was during World War II that the national anthem began to be played at the beginning of each baseball game. It's stuck with it ever since. On the left and right, you see some posters encouraging men to sign up for the armed forces. At the beginning of the war, there were 1.6 million men in the armed forces, but over 15 million men and women had served by the end of the war. People also showed their patriotism by purchasing war bonds to help with the war effort. And on the left, we see a poster encouraging people to back him up. Even if you couldn't serve on the field of battle, you could still support the soldiers in the field. Here we see some additional posters used to generate support. Unfortunately, these played on traditional racial stereotypes and racist interpretations of the Japanese. There were a range of ways that people could volunteer to help with the war effort. Adults could serve as air raid wardens, trying to mobilize people in case there was an attack in the United States. There were a range of drives to try to collect and recycle a range of different goods. And kids could also become involved. Often they could serve as tin can colonels or Uncle Sam's scrappers. Again, on the right, we see another poster encouraging people to purchase war bonds. Next, we'll explore the economic boom that went through American society. Here we see a visual representation of this economic boom. On the left, we see the gross national product. This is like the value of all the products that were being produced in the United States, and a steady growth there. On the right, we see a growth in the wages and salaries that Americans were earning. Conceptually, we see an increase in wages for all workers during the war. Many of them came close to doubling their typical wages. And unemployment rates were terribly low. We'll see some statistics on the next slide. Again, the U.S. economy was characterized by a tremendous economic boom. We can see this with average salaries increasing on the left, and the unemployment rate plummeting in states like Michigan on the right. This map identifies some of the demographic changes throughout the country. There were certain states that gained population during the war. States like Michigan, California, and Washington, where there were large numbers of defense industries. Some states lost population, like Kentucky, Oklahoma, and North Carolina. So you see people moving to where the jobs are during the Second World War. World War II also impacted women's lives and the American family. Here are some statistics dealing with women in the workforce. During the war, over 6 million women entered the workforce for the first time. And what was unique about the workforce during the war was that many of these new female workers were married. Often it was single prior to the war. Single women were in the workforce, but lots of married women, like the one who's shown here, joined the workforce to contribute to the war effort and to contribute money to their families. Here we see a couple of contemporary posters. On the left, we see an image of a woman kind of in a traditional job, trying to encourage a woman to try to work for the government to keep them flying, Miss USA, in like a secretarial type of position. On the right, we see a new image. Hey, any woman can do it. And on the right, we see a woman kind of demonstrating her strength and kind of from a masculine interpretation or perspective. You didn't have to rely on traditional stereotypes. Women could be strong, and women could do the same work that any men could do. Although there were new economic opportunities for many women, they still were responsible for traditional chores like cooking, cleaning, and taking care of kids. So their work jobs just added to their responsibilities. And generally speaking, there was no equal pay for equal work, as women often were paid less than their male counterparts for the same responsibilities. The American family was impacted by involvement in the war as well. The number of marriages and births increased. Of course, so too did divorces. And we see some statistics here. In some cases, the divorce rate went up because couples got married really quickly and maybe they didn't really know each other and then they got divorced. Also interesting is the number of high school enrollments dropped, probably because a lot of young men and young women who were maybe juniors in high school, let's just say, they found out that they could get a really good job even before they were done with high school. So they left school and went into the workforce. Also, with mom maybe working outside the home and dad in the armed forces, rates of juvenile delinquency skyrocketed. We'll explore the impact of the war on race relations next. Native Americans were also impacted by American involvement in the war. About 25,000 Indians served in the armed forces in some manner. The Navajo became famous in the Pacific theater as code talkers. What happened is that they used their native language in order to communicate different things in the Pacific, and the Japanese were never able to break the Navajo code. Other Indian nations also participated as code talkers. The Navajo are just the most familiar. Many Indians also left reservations and they went to the defense industries and they worked in places like Detroit and in other areas as well in order to earn more money for their families, just as other families did as well. African Americans also contributed to the war effort. About 1 million black soldiers served in the armed forces. Of course, they also served in segregated units. On the right, we see an image of the Tuskegee Airmen.
Race relations also were impacted by American involvement in the war. About 700,000 African Americans left the South for northern and western cities during the war. These had the great potential for opportunity, but often African Americans were hired for, quote, the meanest and dirtiest of jobs.
Here's that map again of different communities gaining and losing population. You can see that in some areas like Seattle saw a huge influx of African Americans from 4,000 to 40,000. And the city of Detroit also saw its African American population increase by nearly 50,000, again, as people were looking for jobs in different defense plans.
Racial tension developed during the war, particularly in the city of Detroit. Access to housing was a problem for many of those defense workers as people flocked to Detroit and the surrounding communities to work in defense plants. The government ended up establishing housing projects. One of them was the Sojourner Truth Housing Project, designed for black employees. This was placed smack dab in the middle of a white neighborhood, and you see how the white residents reacted to this. There was a threat of a riot and violence breaking out. Eventually, a brand new facility had to be created outside of the white neighborhood, but it's an example of the tension that was brewing in the city of Detroit during the war. Tension was also seen at various workplaces. In some cases, white employees refused to work alongside black counterparts. They also refused to share the same bathrooms with African Americans. Maybe one quotation here tells the level of tension at different workplaces. As one employee declared, quote, "I'd rather see Hitler and Hirohito win the war than to work beside a nigger on an assembly line." So much for the unity of the country during the war. Tension finally reached a breaking point in the summer of 1943, which is when the Detroit race riots took place, the largest in the country during the Second World War. The spark was a group of teens who fought near Detroit's Belle Isle, near the area's segregated beach, as they were frustrated at the fact that they were only allowed to go on these segregated areas. In the end, after a few days of rioting, 25 blacks and 9 whites were killed. Hundreds were injured, and several buildings were destroyed. Here's an image of the Detroit race riots from the summer of 1943. Here, a car is set on fire, and a mob is in the background.
Hispanics were also impacted by American involvement in the war. See, the problem was that with so many men in the armed forces or working in defense plants, there was a shortage of farm workers. So the United States negotiated a new agreement with the government of Mexico. This was called the Bracero Program. It was in place at the beginning of the war until the mid-1960s. Essentially, the United States government begged these Mexican citizens to come to the United States and to work in the fields. Probably about 4 million people ended up working, like in California for the most part, but also in Texas and some other states in the Southwest. The problem is that American farmers became dependent upon these bracero laborers whom they could pay lower wages to. And even after the end of this program by the mid-1960s, many of those farmers continued to encourage Mexican citizens to come to the United States to work on their farms. But this is kind of the seed or the foundation or the history of many Mexican workers coming to the United States and working as farm laborers. Japanese Americans were also impacted by American involvement in the war, particularly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Some began to call for the forced incarceration of all Americans of Japanese ancestry living in the United States. Early in 1942, Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order Number 9066, which placed well over 100,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. 2/3 of the people placed into these camps were American citizens. Japanese American families were told that they could bring a handful of goods with them, and so you see a lot of camp bundles, so to speak, in the upper left-hand photo here. On the right, we see people waiting in line in order to be able to eat at a meal at one of those makeshift camps. Most of those camps were located in the West, but eventually Japanese American men who were American citizens were allowed to serve in the 442nd Combat Unit. About 18,000 ended up serving during the war, which was the most decorated unit during the war itself. Now, I want to make a distinction here between internment camps and concentration camps. These camps forced people basically to like a prison. However, these were not concentration camps where people were executed. Hitler's final solution placed Jewish people in concentration camps, which led to the deaths of 6 million Jews and several million other victims of the Holocaust. During the war, the United States Supreme Court upheld the internment of the Japanese, basically saying that in harsh times, the government can take harsh action in Korematsu versus the United States. Eventually, during the Reagan administration, the government issued an official apology, and eventually Congress awarded surviving internees $20,000. Well, we're just about done. I'd like to end with some concluding remarks. The United States was impacted tremendously by its involvement in the Second World War. This lectures tried to address how the size and the power of the United States government grew. It's also focused on the changes to the U.S. economy, society, and race relations. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to write an essay that explains these changes and then evaluates whether or not you think these changes were positive or negative for the nation. Well, that's it for today and for this topic. I hope you learned something new. Take care, have a great day, and I'll see you online.